Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the story of Jesus. My name is Jaime Knapp, and in this lesson, we will introduce our study. Let's share the screen and go to the PowerPoint slides. The purpose of our study will be to follow the story of Jesus from his arrival as an infant until his ascension, his return to heaven following his resurrection. We're going to rely primarily on the Gospels, but we're also going to include information from various academic areas such as theology, history, geography, archaeology, and we'll even look briefly into cultural anthropology. The Gospels are going to provide the core of the information we use, and then the work of scholars from the fields I just mentioned will provide some very useful details for us. And our goal is to understand the time and the place in which the story of Jesus occurred. We want to try to get inside of the cultural nuances that may not jump off the page when we're reading in the New Testament. We're going to move through the Gospels, but we're not going to go verse by verse. In fact, we're not even going to go chapter by chapter. A lesson might focus on a few verses, or it might focus on a few chapters. In addition, we might be in Matthew for one lesson. We could be in Luke for the next lesson. And it's quite likely that we'll be in two of the Gospels, maybe even three of the Gospels for a single lesson. So the focus of the study is to follow the story of Jesus. And we want to enrich our understanding of it by trying to get into the setting as much as is possible for 21st century Americans. Our lessons will typically last between 10 and 15 minutes. Occasionally, a lesson might go a little bit longer than 15 minutes. Occasionally, a lesson might be a little bit shorter than 10 minutes, but we'll aim for that range of 10 to 15 minutes, and I'll try to have a new lesson available for us each week. Well, since the primary source of information for us will be the Gospels, we want to introduce each of the Gospels and have the basic understanding of the audience that each author was trying to connect with. So in the New Testament, as we read it, there are four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the synoptic Gospels. And while that may seem like a religious term to you, the root word of synoptic is synopsis. And a synopsis is really just a summary, typically a very brief summary, not intended to be an exhaustive account of everything that happened, but just a brief general summary of what has occurred. So when we look at the Gospels, none of them are going to give us a day-by-day account of everything Jesus did or everything Jesus said. What we do notice, though, is that the summary provided by Matthew, by Mark, and by Luke are so similar that they get referred to as the synoptic Gospels. John, on the other hand, is quite unique in that it does not dovetail very neatly with the synoptic Gospels. So we're going to rely primarily on the synoptic Gospels, and we'll have an occasional visit in the Gospel of John. So let's look at each one of the Gospels briefly. The Gospel written by Matthew was written by an individual who was a follower or a disciple of Jesus. Matthew tells us that in his Gospel, chapter 9 and verse 9. The Gospel of Matthew was written primarily to a Jewish Christian audience. These are individuals who were Christians. They were believers and followers in Jesus Christ, but their cultural background was in Judaism. And so they were still very, very deeply committed to their cultural heritage, but they had made the decision to be a believer in Jesus. Now, how do we know that this was the audience Matthew was writing to? Well, Jewish customs don't really get explained in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew will simply say something and keep moving as if he knows the reader is going to understand what he's saying, whereas some of the other Gospels will take a little bit of time to explain what was just said. Matthew chapter 15, verse 2, Matthew's talking about how the Pharisees emphasized washing your hands to be ceremonially clean before you eat. And Matthew just touches on that and keeps going with his story. Mark, however, slows down a little bit and provides a little more detail in his gospel. In addition, if we read the genealogy that's provided to us in Matthew, we see a couple of very important things. Number one, that's the very first thing Matthew covers. Chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 17. Matthew connects Jesus and his earthly line of descent to Abraham because he's writing primarily to a Jewish Christian audience. And so he needs to be sure that his readers understand that Jesus can trace his earthly line of descent back to Abraham, the individual to whom God made the covenant of a great nation would come from him. And that would have been extremely important to a Jewish individual. Many scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark, but it was actually Peter's account of the story of Jesus. So Peter was telling Mark things that had happened, and Mark was the one who wrote them down. The Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, and many believe it's the first one that was written. Its style is fast-paced and dramatic. Mark doesn't spend any time dealing with genealogies. He doesn't provide any details about shepherds and wise men coming to visit the baby Jesus. Doesn't talk about Jesus being in the temple at the age of 12. He jumps right in and wants to get into the adult life of Jesus. And so in the opening chapter of Mark, here are things that happen. The baptism of Jesus, the temptation of Jesus, the beginning of Jesus' ministry, Jesus casting out demons, and Jesus healing people. And all of that is in the opening chapter of Mark. And the rest of the gospel keeps that same pace up. The Gospel of Luke is actually volume 1 of a 2-volume set, Luke and Acts, that were designed to provide an account of the beginning of Christianity. Now, if you're fairly new to reading the New Testament, you'll notice that after the Gospel of Luke comes the Gospel of John. And if we could somehow lift the Gospel of John and put it before Luke, then we would probably see more clearly the order and the flow of information from Luke into Acts. Both books, Luke and Acts, were written specifically to an individual whose name was Theophilus. There's not a lot of detail known about Theophilus, either in the New Testament or provided by scholars. Luke refers to him as most excellent Theophilus, which means that Theophilus had a higher social position than Luke. And some have speculated that he may have been a Roman government official at some level, but even that isn't entirely clear. More generally, Luke was written to Gentiles. So the Gospel of Matthew, written primarily to Jewish Christians. The book of Luke, written primarily to non-Jewish Christians, or those who were intrigued in the story of Jesus, but not yet Christians. Now, how do we know that Luke was written primarily to non-Jewish people, to Gentiles? Well, a couple different things. First of all, details about Jewish customs are included when they're needed, but in other places they're omitted if they don't really contribute to the story. Here's a couple of examples. Luke chapter 22, verse 1. Luke begins by making reference to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Well, a Jewish individual would know what that meant, but because Luke was writing primarily to non-Jewish people, immediately after that he puts in, which is also known as the Passover, or which is also called the Passover. And so even non-Jewish people who lived in that geographic area would have understood what the Passover was, or at least would have heard of the Passover, even if they didn't know its other name, Feast of Unleavened Bread. When Jesus was pronouncing his woes, woe unto thee, Matthew 23, verse 13, also found in Luke 11:52, one of Jesus's woe statements was, woe unto you, teachers of the law, scribes and Pharisees. And Matthew includes that sort of language. Luke just includes the word lawyers. So woe unto you, lawyers. Why? Because his audience may or may not have understood what a Pharisee was, or some of the other teachers of the law that a Jewish audience would have. We can also see a difference in the genealogies that are provided by Matthew and Luke. Luke doesn't get around to including his genealogy until chapter 3. Remember, Matthew started chapter 1, verse 1. It's also very interesting and important to notice that when Luke traces the earthly descent of Jesus, he doesn't stop with Abraham, as Matthew did. He goes all the way to Adam, tracing Jesus' earthly line of descent all the way back to the creation, to the very first man. And the message of that and the reason for doing that is Luke wanted to let non-Jewish people know that salvation is available to everyone, not just to Jewish individuals, because we can all trace our line of descent back to Adam. The Gospel of John is unique. John was an eyewitness of the life and the ministry of Jesus. In fact, in many ways, John was part of an inner circle, Peter, James, and John, that was extremely close to Jesus during his ministry. And so John has some details that are not going to be available in the other Gospels. John provides a very meticulous accounting of the life and activities of Jesus. Not every single thing Jesus said or every single thing Jesus did, but a very, very detailed and meticulous accounting of the life and the activities of Jesus, primarily during his years of ministry. Well, that's our introduction to the story of Jesus and the direction and the plan we have for our study. In our next lesson, we're going to focus on the Roman census. I hope you can join us.